The forbidden encounter. Celia stood at the edge of the grand hall, her sharp silver eyes scanning the room. The Verneri delegation, dressed in their flowing, glimmering robes, filled one side of the room. Across from them stood the human representatives in their stiff suits and uniforms, their faces etched with determination. Celia had been taught all her life that humans were unpredictable, violent, and dangerous. Yet here she was, an alien diplomat on Earth, representing her kind in these fragile peace talks. She adjusted her translator device, her three-fingered hand trembling slightly. "Stay calm, stay distant," she reminded herself. Her elders had drilled this into her during her training. Verneri and humans were too different, too incompatible. Emotions, they warned, could cloud judgment, and emotions were something humans seemed to have in abundance. As Celia observed the humans, one caught her attention. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't dressed in a formal uniform or suit. He wore a simple lab coat, his brown hair slightly messy, as though he'd been too busy working to bother combing it. He didn't even look at the Verneri delegation with suspicion or fear like most others. Instead, his hazel eyes were full of curiosity, almost warmth. Celia quickly averted her gaze, her pale skin flushing a faint shade of blue. Foolish, she thought. Why would he look at me differently? To him, I'm just another Verneri, a reminder of the war they barely survived. But then it happened. The man, noticing her glance, smiled softly. It wasn't a political smile or one meant to mask an agenda. It was genuine, simple, and disarming. Celia's heart fluttered in a way that made her feel both curious and alarmed. She didn't understand why, but something about him seemed different. As the meeting droned on, filled with speeches and veiled accusations, Celia found her focus slipping. Her kind was arguing about territorial agreements and trade routes, but her mind kept drifting back to that human's eyes. What was his name? Why did he seem so at ease, even in a room filled with tension? Suddenly, a voice broke through her thoughts. "Dr. Ethan Carter, you'll present your findings next," said one of the human leaders. The man in the lab coat, Ethan, stepped forward, holding a small device in his hand. Celia's curiosity deepened. A scientist. What could he possibly have to add to a political negotiation? Ethan cleared his throat and began speaking, his voice steady but passionate. "This device," he said, holding it up, "represents what could be the start of something greater than mere peace. It's a fusion of human and Verneri technology, a first step toward true cooperation." The room fell silent. Even the Verneri, who were known for their stoicism, exchanged uncertain glances. Celia's pulse quickened. She leaned forward slightly, her interest piqued. Collaboration between their species was unheard of, almost taboo. Yet here was this human, boldly suggesting it. As Ethan continued his presentation, Celia felt something shift inside her. His words were not just logical, they were hopeful. He spoke of a future where their species could work together, not out of necessity but out of mutual respect. It was a vision Celia had never dared to imagine. When the presentation ended, the room erupted into murmurs. Some humans applauded, while others shook their heads in disapproval. Among the Verneri, there was only silence. Celia's superior, Ambassador Talek, leaned toward her and whispered, "Do not be swayed by their words, Celia. Humans have always been skilled at manipulation. They seek to draw us into their chaos." Celia nodded, though her thoughts were far from agreement. Her gaze drifted back to Ethan, who was now stepping away from the podium. He paused for a moment, glancing her way, and then, so subtly that no one else seemed to notice, he slipped a small data pad onto the table near her. Celia froze. Was that meant for her? Her mind raced with questions. Should she pick it up? Was it a trap? She glanced at Ambassador Talek, who was too busy arguing with a human delegate to notice. With a quick, deliberate motion, Celia reached out and pocketed the data pad. Her heart pounded as though she'd committed a crime. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur. As the delegations began to disperse, Celia excused herself, retreating to a quiet corner of the hall. She pulled out the data pad, her hands shaking slightly as she activated it. A single message appeared on the screen. Observation deck. Midnight. Trust me. Celia's breath caught. Trust. That was a dangerous word, especially coming from a human. Yet something inside her whispered that this was important, that she needed to know what he had to say. As the sun set over the sprawling human city, Celia stood by the window of her guest quarters, staring at the skyline. The message burned in her mind. She knew the risks. If anyone discovered her meeting with Ethan, it could ruin her career, or worse. But the questions refused to leave her alone. Why had he chosen her? What was so urgent that he would risk this? When the clock struck midnight, Celia made her decision. Draping her hooded cloak over her slender frame, she slipped out of her quarters and into the silent corridors of the embassy. The air was cool as she stepped onto the observation deck, her heart pounding in her chest. And there he was, Ethan, standing alone under the stars, waiting for her. Secret meeting. Celia hesitated at the edge of the observation deck, her breath catching in her throat. The city lights below twinkled like a sea of stars, but her focus was on the human standing near the railing, his back turned to her. Ethan. His stance was calm, almost too calm for someone who had just risked his career, and possibly his life, by summoning her here. She stepped forward, her soft boots making no sound on the metallic floor. "You should not have contacted me," she said, her voice steady but low. "If anyone finds out, we will both suffer the consequences." Ethan turned to face her, his hazel eyes catching the faint light. "And yet you're here," he replied, his tone warm but firm. "That means you're curious. And maybe, just maybe, you know something isn't right." Celia frowned, pulling her hood tighter over her pale silver hair. "I am here to listen, nothing more. Speak quickly." Ethan nodded and stepped closer, though he kept a respectful distance. "Your leaders have lied to you," he began, his voice laced with urgency. "The stories about humanity's violent past, about why the Vrenari left Earth centuries ago, they aren't the whole truth." Celia stiffened. "You speak boldly for someone with no proof. What you suggest is treasonous." Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small holoprojector. "Then let me show you." He activated the device, and a 3D hologram flickered to life between them. Celia's breath caught as she saw what appeared to be ancient records, images of a lush green earth, thriving with Vrenari colonies alongside human settlements. The two species were shown working together, sharing technology, even celebrating side by side. It was a stark contrast to the narrative she had been taught, that the Vrenari had fled Earth to escape humanity's savage wars. Ethan's voice broke through her thoughts. "These are archived records I uncovered while working on joint projects. Your people didn't leave because of us. They left because of something they created. A weapon, one so dangerous it threatened the survival of both our species." Celia stared at the hologram, her mind racing. The images felt raw, real, and undeniable. But if they were true, it meant her entire life had been built on a lie. "Why would my people hide this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan hesitated, then replied, "Because they fear the truth. They fear what will happen if humanity finds out about the weapon, and that it still exists, buried somewhere on Earth." Celia's heart sank. A weapon powerful enough to drive an entire race away. The thought chilled her. "If this is true," she said slowly, "then why tell me? Why not bring this to your leaders?" Ethan shook his head. "Because your leaders would silence me, and my own people wouldn't trust a single word of it without your cooperation. I need someone on the inside, someone who can see the truth and help me expose it." Celia stepped back, her mind reeling. She had expected secrets, perhaps even conspiracies, but nothing of this magnitude. "You ask for a dangerous alliance," she said, her voice wavering. "If I help you, I risk everything, my position, my life. And if you don't," Ethan countered, "we risk something much greater, That weapon isn't just a relic of the past. My research suggests it's still active, and it's drawing power from deep within the Earth. If someone finds it and activates it. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The gravity of his words hung heavy in the air. Celia turned to the cityscape, her thoughts a whirlwind of doubt and fear. Everything she had been taught warned her to distrust humans, to see them as impulsive and dangerous. But Ethan didn't fit that image. His every action spoke of conviction, not malice. And the hologram was proof she couldn't ignore. She took a deep breath and faced him. If I agree to help, we must be careful. If my people discover what you've told me, they will stop at nothing to silence us both. Ethan gave a small, relieved smile. Careful is my middle name. Celia's brow furrowed. Humans have middle names. Ethan laughed softly. It's an expression. You'll get used to it. Before she could respond, a faint sound echoed from behind them. Footsteps. Celia's sharp ears caught the rhythm, and her body tensed. We're not alone, she whispered. Ethan's face darkened. I thought I was careful. I didn't tell anyone. Celia's instincts took over. Grabbing his arm, she pulled him toward the shadows at the far end of the deck. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate. A figure emerged from the corridor, a Vrenari guard, tall and imposing, scanning the area with a sharp, glowing device. Celia's pulse quickened. If they were caught, there would be no trial, no negotiation, just swift punishment. The guard paused, his eyes narrowing as he looked around. Celia held her breath, silently praying the shadows would hide them. Ethan stayed still, his breathing steady but shallow. After what felt like an eternity, the guard turned and walked away, his heavy steps fading into the distance. Celia exhaled and released Ethan's arm. You were followed, she hissed. This was reckless. Ethan nodded, guilt flashing across his face. I'll be more careful next time. Her eyes narrowed. There may not be a next time. Despite her words, Celia felt a flicker of determination growing within her. The truth, no matter how dangerous, was worth uncovering. As she slipped back into the safety of the embassy, her mind was made up. She would help Ethan. But the path ahead would be more dangerous than either of them could imagine. And for the first time in her life, Celia felt both fear and something she couldn't name. A connection, fragile yet undeniable. The warning. Celia sat stiffly in the council chamber of her ship, the Orax Primus. The walls hummed softly with the ship's bioreactor, a sound that had always soothed her. Today, it grated on her nerves. Ambassador Talik's sharp, accusatory tone was no help. You were seen on the observation deck last night, Talik said, pacing back and forth. His piercing blue gaze landed on her, unblinking. What were you doing there, Celia? Celia fought to keep her expression neutral, her hands folded in her lap. I needed time to think. Ambassador, the human city below, its lights and movement. It's unlike anything I've seen. It was distracting. Talik's eyes narrowed, his towering form leaning closer. Distracting, or tempting. Humans have a way of luring the unwary into their chaos. You must not fall prey to their deceptions. I am loyal to the Vrenari cause, Celia replied firmly, though her heart raced. She thought of Ethan's hologram, his desperate plea. The truth she now carried felt like a burning coal in her chest. Good, Talik said, his tone softening slightly, though his suspicion lingered. You are young, Celia, and perhaps too curious for your own good, but you are also one of our brightest. That is why I will say this only once. Stay away from the humans, especially the one called Ethan Carter. He is trouble. Her stomach churned. Did Talik know about their meeting? Or was this a calculated warning? Either way, she couldn't afford to reveal anything. What has he done to warrant such distrust? She asked, feigning disinterest. Talik straightened, his long robes trailing as he resumed pacing. He is a scientist, clever and resourceful, but his kind is notorious for meddling where they shouldn't. Rumors have reached us that he is working on projects involving forbidden knowledge, knowledge that could disrupt the delicate balance we've maintained. Celia remained silent, processing his words. So Talik did know something, but how much? She nodded, keeping her expression impassive. I understand, Ambassador. I will avoid him. Talik studied her for a long moment, then sighed. Good. Remember, Celia, the unity of the Vernaried depends on our discipline. Humans thrive on chaos. If you stray too close to their fire, you will burn. The word hung in the air long after Talik left the chamber. Celia exhaled shakily, her resolve hardening. She couldn't ignore the truth she'd seen. If Ethan was right, and the weapon was real, it wasn't just a matter of politics, it was a matter of survival. Later that evening, Celia sat alone in her quarters, the hologram Ethan had given her flickering before her. The images of Vernari and humans coexisting haunted her. They didn't look like enemies. They looked hopeful. How could her leaders have buried this? Why hide something so vital? Her thoughts were interrupted by a chime. A secure message flashed across her console, coded in the high-priority encryption used only by senior officials. Her pulse quickened as she read the words. You are being watched. Do not trust anyone. The message disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving her staring at the empty screen. Her heart pounded. Someone within the Vrenari ranks knew she was wavering. Was it a warning or a trap? Determined to uncover the truth, Celia decided to visit the archives aboard the Orax premise. She moved cautiously through the dimly lit corridors, her footsteps muffled by the soft, biosensitive flooring. Every corner felt like a potential ambush. Every shadow seemed to move. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The archives were heavily secured, their entrance guarded by a retinal scanner and voice authentication. Celia hesitated before placing her palm on the scanner. The device hummed, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. She stepped inside, surrounded by glowing data streams and holographic displays. Access records, Earth-Vernari relations, she commanded, her voice steady. The central console blinked, then responded, restricted access, authorization required. Celia bit her lip. She knew this would happen. Glancing over her shoulder, she ensured the room was empty before pulling out a small override chip, a tool she had acquired during her training, meant for emergencies. She inserted it into the console, bypassing the security protocols. The holograms flared to life, displaying classified documents, images, and audio logs. Her heart raced as she scrolled through them. The truth was worse than she'd imagined. The Vernari hadn't left Earth because of humanity's violence. They had left because of their own mistakes. A failed experiment to harness Earth's unique magnetic fields had led to the creation of a weapon so unstable it nearly tore the planet apart. Instead of admitting their fault, the Vernari had blamed humanity, ensuring their species would never return to Earth. Celia's hands trembled as she absorbed the data. The holograms shifted to show recent activity, a faint energy signature coming from Earth's surface, matching the weapon's ancient design. It was reactivating. The implications were terrifying. Before she could process further, the sound of footsteps outside the archive door jolted her. She quickly removed the override chip, shutting down the console. The door slid open, and Celia found herself face to face with Talik. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing. Celia swallowed hard, her mind racing for an explanation. Researching cultural nuances for the negotiations, she said, keeping her voice calm. "I wanted to better understand the human's perspective." Talik studied her for a long moment, then stepped closer. "Be careful, Celia. Curiosity can be dangerous. And betrayal, even more so." Without another word, he turned and left, his warning echoing in her mind. Back in her quarters, Celia received another message from Ethan. "The truth is buried deep beneath the archives. Meet me again." Her hands tightened into fists. The truth was no longer just buried. It was alive and threatening to destroy everything. As much as she feared the path ahead, she knew there was no turning back. Ethan was her only ally now, and together they would have to face the lies that had been woven for generations. Her kind might call it betrayal. She called it survival. Forbidden discovery. The human laboratory was hidden beneath the ruins of an abandoned city, a relic of Earth's distant past. Celia tightened her hood, her alien features obscured in the darkness. The journey had been perilous. She'd evaded Verneri patrols and slipped past human guards, all to meet Ethan at this forgotten place. Her kind would call it madness, but she called it something else. Truth. Ethan met her at the entrance, his lab coat replaced by a rugged jacket, his face smudged with dirt. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, his voice low but steady. "I shouldn't have," Celia replied, glancing around the rubble-strewn surroundings. "If anyone discovers this, my people will exile me, or worse." Ethan's eyes softened. "And yet, here you are. That says something." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Together, they descended into the labyrinth of tunnels beneath the city, guided only by the faint glow of Ethan's portable light. The air grew colder, carrying the scent of rust and damp stone. "This place was once a research hub," Ethan explained as they walked. "A joint effort between humans and Verneri during the brief years of peace. They were working on something revolutionary, a way to harness Earth's magnetic fields for clean, limitless energy. And instead," Celia said, her voice tight, "they created a weapon." Ethan nodded grimly. "A weapon powerful enough to devastate both our species. But what's worse, it was never truly decommissioned. The energy signature we've been tracking suggests it's still functional, and someone is trying to reactivate it." Celia stopped in her tracks, her breath catching. "Do you know who?" Ethan shook his head. "Not yet. That's why we're here, to find answers." The lab itself was a haunting sight. Broken equipment lay scattered across the floor, tangled wires dangling from the ceiling like vines. Holographic projectors flickered weakly, casting ghostly images of long-dead scientists and engineers. Ethan approached a central console, brushing off years of dust. "This should still work," he muttered, powering up the device with a handheld generator. The console hummed to life, displaying encrypted files. Celia watched as he worked, his fingers moving deftly across the interface. She couldn't help but feel a pang of admiration for his determination. Humans were resilient, more so than her people gave them credit for. "Here it is," Ethan said, pulling up a series of schematics. The holograms filled the room, displaying the weapon in vivid detail. It was massive, a towering structure buried deep within the Earth's crust. The design was elegant yet terrifying, its core glowing with unstable energy. Celia's stomach churned. This shouldn't exist." Ethan glanced at her. "It shouldn't, but it does. And it's worse than I imagined." He expanded one of the files, revealing a recent activation log. "Someone accessed the weapon's systems just a week ago. They're testing it." Celia. She felt a cold dread settle over her. Whoever it is, they could destroy Earth. Even my people wouldn't survive the fallout. "That's not all," Ethan said, his tone dark. "These logs show traces of Verneri encryption. Your people are involved." Celia recoiled, her mind racing. "No, that's impossible. The Verneri would never. They wouldn't risk." "Wouldn't they?" Ethan interrupted, his voice sharp. "Think about it. Your leaders have lied to you for centuries. They blamed humanity for everything. But the truth is, they're just as culpable, maybe more." The weight of his words hit her like a physical blow. She wanted to deny it, to defend her people, but the evidence was right in front of her. The weapon wasn't just a relic of the past, it was a ticking time bomb, and her own kind might be holding the trigger. Before she could respond, a sharp beep echoed through the lab. Ethan froze. "Movement," he whispered, pointing to a security monitor. A group of figures, Verneri enforcers, was closing in on their location. "We have to leave." "Now," Celia said, grabbing Ethan's arm. "No," he said, pulling away. "Not yet. We need to download this data. It's the only proof we have. Celia hesitated, torn between the urgency of their situation and the importance of the information. Finally, she nodded. Make it quick. Ethan worked furiously, transferring the files to a portable drive. The sound of footsteps grew louder, echoing through the tunnels. Celia's instincts screamed at her to run, but she held her ground, her sharp eyes scanning for an escape route. Got it, Ethan said, slipping the drive into his jacket. Let's move. They darted through the maze of tunnels, the enforcers hot on their heels. Celia's heart pounded as she led Ethan through a narrow passage, her alien agility allowing her to navigate the terrain with ease. Ethan followed closely, his breaths ragged but determined. As they reached the surface, a blinding light engulfed them. A Verneri ship hovered overhead, its spotlight trained on them. Celia shielded her eyes, her mind racing for a solution. Stop where you are, a voice commanded, amplified by the ship's speakers. Ethan looked at her, his expression a mix of fear and trust. What now? Celia's jaw tightened. We don't stop. She grabbed his hand and sprinted toward the ruins, weaving through the crumbling structures as the ship's spotlight followed them. Blaster fire erupted, striking the ground dangerously close. Celia pushed Ethan ahead, her instincts taking over. Finally, they'd reached the cover of a collapsed building. The ship hovered above, its searchlight scanning the area. Celia pressed a finger to her lips, signaling Ethan to stay silent. Minutes passed like hours before the ship finally moved on, its engines roaring as it disappeared into the night sky. Ethan exhaled shakily. That was close. Celia nodded, her mind already racing ahead. Too close. They'll be back, and they'll bring reinforcements. What do we do now? He asked. Celia looked at him, her resolve hardening. We find the weapon, and we destroy it, before anyone else can use it. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. Together. Together, she said, though her voice carried the weight of the dangerous path they now faced. As they disappeared into the shadows, the full gravity of their mission settled over them. They were no longer just uncovering the truth. They were fighting to prevent the destruction of two worlds. A desperate gamble. The journey to the weapon's location wasn't just dangerous. It was nearly impossible. Deep beneath a mountain range, buried in an ancient chamber protected by layers of Verneri defenses, the weapon pulsed like a dormant heart. Its presence wasn't just hidden. It was deliberately buried, as though even its creators feared its existence. Celia and Ethan trekked through the wilderness, the jagged peaks of the mountains rising like jagged teeth. The harsh winds carried whispers of the past, but their minds were locked on the present danger. Each step brought them closer to the truth, and closer to those hunting them. We're being tracked, Celia said, her silver eyes scanning the horizon. She had spotted the faint shimmer of a cloaked Verneri scout ship hours ago. They're letting us lead them to the weapon. Ethan wiped sweat from his brow, adjusting the heavy pack on his back. Then we have to get there first. Celia stopped and turned to him, her expression sharp. It's not just about getting there, Ethan. The weapon is ancient, unstable. If we make one mistake, it could destroy everything. And if we do nothing, Ethan countered, his hazel eyes fierce. Your people will use it, or someone else will. We don't have a choice. Celia wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. The weapon's power was too great, its existence too dangerous. It had to be destroyed, no matter the cost. After days of grueling travel, they finally reached the entrance to the weapon's underground chamber. It was carved into the side of the mountain, a massive ancient gate etched with glowing Verneri runes. The air was thick with energy, a faint hum vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. Ethan approached the gate cautiously, his eyes scanning the runes. Can you read it? Celia nodded, her fingers tracing the ancient script. It's a warning, or maybe a threat. The heart of the earth beats here. Touch it, and the world will shatter. Comforting, Ethan muttered, pulling out a small device. Let's hope this translator works. I've only seen rooms like this in archived texts. As Ethan worked to bypass the gate's lock, Celia kept watch, her senses on high alert. The mountain was too quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural. Her people were near, she could feel it. The gate hissed and groaned, its ancient mechanisms springing to life. Slowly, it began to open, revealing a long, dark corridor descending into the mountain's heart. Ethan grinned, but his relief was short-lived. A distant roar echoed behind them, growing louder by the second. Celia turned, her heart sinking as she saw a Verneri ship decloaking in the sky. "They found us," she said, drawing her small plasma blade. "Get inside." Now. The corridor was damp and dimly lit, the walls glowing faintly with bioluminescent veins. Ethan's footsteps echoed alongside Celia's as they hurried deeper into the mountain. The hum of the weapon grew stronger, the air thick with static electricity. "This place feels alive," Ethan said, glancing at the glowing walls. "It is," Celia replied, her voice tight. "The weapon isn't just a machine. It's fused with organic matter, my people's attempt to create something unstoppable." Ethan's eyes widened. "You mean it's alive?" "In a way, yes," Celia said, her voice low. "And that makes it even more dangerous. If it awakens fully, it won't just destroy the earth, it will spread, consuming everything in its path." The corridor opened into a massive chamber, and there it was, the weapon. A towering structure of metal and crystal, its core pulsating with a dim, ominous light. Tendrils of glowing energy snaked out from its base, anchoring it to the surrounding rock. Ethan stared, awe and fear warring in his expression. "It's beautiful and horrifying." Celia approached the weapon cautiously, her mind racing. "We need to overload it, force it to collapse in on itself before it can fully activate." "And how do we do that?" Ethan asked, already unpacking his tools. Celia hesitated. "We'll have to interface with it directly. But the core is unstable. If we're not careful, it could trigger a chain reaction." Ethan glanced at her, determination hardening his features. "Then we'll be careful." As they worked, the hum of the weapon grew louder, its light intensifying. Celia accessed the weapon's control systems, her fingers moving deftly over the ancient interface. Ethan connected his tools to the core, his face tense with concentration. "This thing's defenses are insane," Ethan said, sweat dripping from his forehead. "It's like it's fighting me." "It is," Celia replied, her voice grim. "The weapon's organic components are designed to resist tampering. Keep going. I'll try to disable its self-repair functions." Suddenly, a blast shook the chamber, sending debris raining down from the ceiling. Celia spun around to see Verneri enforcers pouring into the chamber, their plasma rifles raised. "Step away from the weapon," one of them commanded, his voice amplified by a translator. Celia's plasma blade ignited with a sharp hum. "They'll kill us both," she said to Ethan. "Keep working. I'll hold them off." "Celia, you can't." Ethan started, but she cut him off. "Just do it," she shouted, charging toward the enforcers. Celia moved with the grace and precision of a warrior, her blade flashing as she deflected incoming blasts. She danced through the chaos, her focus unwavering. But the enforcers were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. Behind her, Ethan worked frantically, his tools sparking as he forced the weapon's core into overload. "Almost there," he yelled, the weapon's hum reaching an ear-splitting pitch. A sharp pain shot through Celia's side as a plasma bolt grazed her. She stumbled but pushed forward, her blade cutting through the final enforcer. Blood seeped from her wound, but she ignored it, turning to see Ethan standing before the core, his hands trembling. "It's done," he said, his voice shaking. "But we have to leave now. The overload will destroy everything." Celia nodded, her breathing ragged. "Go. I'll cover you." "What about you?" Ethan asked, his voice thick with concern. She hesitated, then said, "I'll follow. Just go." Ethan hesitated for a moment, then nodded. sprinting toward the exit. Celia watched him go, a sinking feeling in her chest. The weapon's hum became a roar, its light blinding as the core began to destabilize. And for the first time, she wondered if she would make it out alive. The final stand. The ground trembled as the weapon's core began to destabilize, its pulsating glow now blinding. Celia clutched her side, the plasma whelmed searing with pain, but she forced herself forward. The chamber's air grew thick with energy, each breath like fire in her lungs. Ethan's retreating figure disappeared into the tunnel, and she felt a pang of regret. He didn't know the full truth. She didn't intend to follow. Celia staggered toward the weapon, her plasma blade flickering in her hand. The core's containment shields were breaking down, arcs of unstable energy lashing out like wild beasts. She knew what she had to do. The weapon couldn't simply be overloaded, it had to be neutralized completely. And that meant activating the failsafe buried deep in its programming. The failsafe that could only be triggered by a Vernari. Ethan ran through the twisting tunnels, his heart pounding louder than the distant hum of the weapon. He reached the surface, gasping for air, and turned back toward the mountain. The ground beneath him shook violently, cracks spidering out from the entrance. Dust and debris rained down as the structure began to collapse. "Celia," he shouted, his voice echoing off the jagged peaks. But there was no response. He hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to run, to save himself. But something inside him refused to leave her behind. Gritting his teeth, he turned and ran back into the tunnels, the ground crumbling beneath his feet. Inside the chamber, Celia had reached the weapon's control panel, her hands trembling as she accessed the ancient interface. The failsafe's activation sequence was buried under layers of encrypted commands, each one more complex than the last. Sweat dripped down her face as she worked, her vision blurring from the pain in her side. The console flared to life, displaying a final warning in Vernari script. Failsafe activation will result in complete neutralization of the weapon. Operator survival not guaranteed. Celia hesitated for only a moment. Her kind had created this monstrosity, and it was her duty to end it. She pressed her hand to the biometric scanner, her voice steady as she spoke the activation command in her native tongue. Execute. The weapon's core surged, its light dimming for a brief moment before intensifying into a blinding blaze. The ground beneath her buckled, and Celia was thrown backward, her body slamming into the chamber wall. The failsafe was working, but the weapon was fighting back, its energy spiraling out of control. Ethan burst into the chamber just as the first explosion rocked the weapon's structure. His eyes widened at the sight of Celia crumpled against the wall, her cloak singed and her breathing shallow. Without thinking, he sprinted to her side. "Celia," he shouted, shaking her gently. Her silver eyes fluttered open, and she looked at him with a mix of surprise and frustration. "You idiot," she rasped. "You were supposed to leave. And let you do this alone." He shot back, his voice breaking. "Not a chance." Another explosion tore through the chamber, and the weapon's tendrils began to writhe, their energy flaring wildly. Ethan glanced at the console, understanding instantly what she had done. "You activated the failsafe. It's going to destroy the entire chamber." Celia nodded weakly. "It's the only way." "But we can still get out," Ethan said, his voice desperate. "We can." "No," Celia interrupted, her tone firm despite her weakening state. "The failsafe requires constant input. If I leave, the weapon could reactivate." Ethan's heart sank. There has to be another way. "There isn't," she said, her gaze locking onto his. "Go. You can still make it out. The files you downloaded, they'll be the proof you need. Expose the truth. End this madness." He stared at her, his mind racing. Leaving her behind felt like a betrayal, but staying meant both their deaths. "I'm not leaving you," he said finally, his voice trembling with emotion. Celia's expression softened, a faint smile crossing her lips. "You humans, so stubborn. Another explosion shook the chamber, and a massive crack split the ceiling. Ethan made his decision. He grabbed her under the arms and hoisted her up, ignoring her protests. "If we die together," he said, determination burning in his eyes. "You don't understand," she said, her voice growing weaker. "The failsafe." "I'll figure it out," Ethan shouted, dragging her toward the exit. "But I'm not leaving you behind." The chamber continued to collapse as they stumbled through the tunnels, each step a battle against the shaking ground and falling debris. Celia's strength faded rapidly, and Ethan had to carry her, his arms burning from the effort. They reached the surface just as the final explosion erupted behind them, sending a shockwave that knocked them both to the ground. Ethan shielded Celia with his body as debris rained down, the mountain crumbling into itself. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, Ethan lifted his head. The weapon's hum was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. He looked down at Celia, her breathing faint but steady. "You did it," he whispered, a wave of relief washing over him. "We did it." Celia opened her eyes, her gaze unfocused. "The weapon. It's gone." "It's gone," Ethan confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. "You stopped it." She gave a weak nod, a small, tired smile playing on her lips. "Then it was worth it." Ethan held her close, his own exhaustion threatening to overwhelm him. The weapon was destroyed, but the cost of their victory had been immense. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, he made a silent promise. To ensure her sacrifice, and their fight, would not be in vain. Together, they had faced the impossible. And together, they had won. For now, love and sacrifice. The sunrise painted the ruins of the mountain in soft hues of orange and gold, but the beauty was lost on Ethan. He sat beside Celia, cradling her against his chest. Her breathing was faint, each breath a struggle. The weapon was gone, but its destruction had left scars on both of them, physical and emotional. "Stay with me," he whispered, his voice breaking. "We've come too far for this to be the end." Celia's silver eyes opened, duller than before. A faint smile touched her lips. "You, humans, always so dramatic." Ethan chuckled despite the tears threatening to fall. "And you Verneri are always so stubborn." She reached up with a trembling hand, her three-fingered touch brushing his face. "We made a good team." Her words sent a pang through his chest. "Don't talk like this. We'll get help. You'll be fine." But they both knew the truth. Her injuries were severe, and the strain of activating the failsafe had taken a toll on her body. She had risked everything to stop the weapon, and now her body was failing her. Suddenly, a shadow loomed over them. Ethan looked up, his heart sinking as a Verneri shuttle descended, its sleek, ominous form landing amid the rubble. The ramp lowered, and Ambassador Talek emerged, flanked by a group of enforcers. His piercing blue eyes locked onto Celia, then shifted to Ethan. "So, this is what betrayal looks like," Talek said, his voice cold and heavy with disdain. Ethan stood, shielding Celia with his body. "She didn't betray you," he snapped. "She saved all of us, Verneri and humans alike." Talek ignored him, his gaze fixed on Celia. "You have disgraced our people, Celia. Your actions will not be forgotten." Celia coughed weakly, her voice barely audible. "You lied to us, Talek. To all of us. The weapon, it was our mistake." Talek's expression darkened. "It was a necessary lie. The truth would have fractured our unity, turned us against one another. And now you've exposed us to the humans. Do you understand the consequences of what you've done?" Ethan clenched his fists. "She did the right thing. Your lies would have led to annihilation." Talek raised a hand, silencing him. "This is not your concern, human. Celia's fate will be decided by her people." Celia struggled to sit up, her voice stronger despite her injuries. "My fate is my own. And so is the future of the Vernari. You cannot silence the truth anymore. Talek, the weapon is gone, but the lies must go with it. For a moment, the air was thick with tension. Talek's enforcers stood ready, their weapons raised. Ethan's heart pounded, unsure whether they would leave alive. Then, slowly, Talek lowered his gaze. "You've left me no choice, Celia," he said quietly. "Your actions have forced us to confront what we've buried for centuries. But the cost." His voice trailed off, heavy with unspoken consequences. Talek turned to his enforcers and gestured for them to stand down. "You've done what you believed was right. I only hope it doesn't doom us all." The shuttle carried them back to the Verneri command ship. Celia was rushed to the medical bay, her condition critical. Ethan paced outside the sterile room, his mind racing. Talek's words lingered like a shadow. Would the truth unite their species, or drive them further apart? Hours passed before the door opened, and a Verneri medic stepped out. "She is stable, but her recovery will take time. You may see her." Ethan entered the room, his heart aching as he saw Celia lying on the biobed, her pale skin even more translucent under the harsh lights. Her eyes fluttered open as he approached, and a faint smile graced her lips. "You're still here," she murmured. "Where else would I be?" He replied, taking her hand in his. "You're not getting rid of me that easily." Her smile widened, though her strength was still fragile. "We stopped it, didn't we?" Ethan nodded. "We did. The weapon's gone. But the fight isn't over. Your people and mine. There's still so much to rebuild." Celia's gaze softened. "Then rebuild it together. Promise me, Ethan." "I promise," he said, his voice steady. "We'll build something better. Something worth all of this." In the weeks that followed, the truth about the weapon and the lies surrounding it began to spread. Talek, reluctantly, revealed the ancient mistakes of the Vernari, and Ethan's research provided evidence of humanity's capacity for collaboration and resilience. The path to peace wasn't easy. There were protests, arguments, and resistance on both sides. But amid the chaos, hope began to take root. Celia, though still recovering, became a symbol of unity between their species. Her defiance of tradition and her willingness to risk everything inspired many, both Verneri and human. And by her side, Ethan stood as a testament to the strength of cooperation and trust. 1 year later, Celia and Ethan stood together on a newly constructed platform orbiting Earth, a joint Verneri-human station dedicated to research, exploration, and understanding. Below them, the blue planet shone brightly, its future uncertain but full of potential. "Do you think it'll last?" Ethan asked, his gaze fixed on the Earth. Celia glanced at him, her silver eyes thoughtful. "It won't be easy, but if we can stand together after everything we've faced, then yes, I think it will." Ethan smiled, his hand brushing hers. "Here's to the future, then, whatever it brings." Celia nodded, her lips curving into a small, hopeful smile. "To the future." As the station's lights illuminated the dark expanse of space, two figures stood side by side, alien and human, united not by blood, but by a shared dream. Together, they had defied the odds, and together, they would build a new legacy.